Just 18 years old, he was kicked out with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. While riding through a lonely cliff trail, he discovered an old hidden cabin no one in the valley talked about. But when he stepped inside, what he saw was so shocking that he immediately called 911. The strange part: the person responsible wasn't supposed to exist anymore, and what happened next turned a quiet cowboy town into a dangerous mystery. Before we start, join our YouTube family by subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, let's get into the story. The sun was slowly sinking behind the endless plains of the frontier. A warm wind carried dust across the dry land. The small frontier town of Red Hollow stood quietly in the distance. Travelers rarely stopped here unless they had a reason. He rode slowly toward the town on his dark brown horse. Against the dirt road, echoing through, his long coat moved slightly with the wind. A thick beard framed his face. But David Morgan was not as old as he looked. As he approached the town, the nervous glances from strangers, the subtle tension in the weather, the man, David was used to that. Red Hollow wasn't much different from the dozens of towns. A blacksmith shop stood near the entrance of town, sky as the hammer struck glowing iron. Its wooden porch lined with barrels and sacks of grain. The saloon, sometimes it was the heart of the town. David dismounted his horse and tied the reins to a wooden post outside the saloon, shaking its head as if it too could feel the strange tension in the air. "Easy, Rust," he muttered quietly. The saloon doors swung open with a familiar creaking sound as David stepped inside. Whiskey, tobacco, smoke, sweat, and the faint scent of gun oil, lanterns that cast long. A piano player sat in the corner. Several rough-looking men stood at the bar drinking quietly. Conversations died. David slowly walked toward the bar, boots echoing against the wooden floor, painting the sky with deep shades of orange and crimson, whispering through the tall grass like a secret that the earth itself wanted to hide, its wooden buildings glowing faintly under the fading light of the evening. And David Morgan had a reason. The sound of hooves pressing, the silent evening, and the wide brim of his cowboy hat cast a shadow across his sharp eyes, giving him the look of a man who had seen too many winters and too many battles. Life on the frontier had a way of aging a man quickly. He noticed the same things he always did when entering a new place. The way conversations suddenly became quieter when he passed. When people tried to figure out arriving was trouble or salvation. A cowboy with a revolver at his side and scars on his knuckles rarely looked like peace. David had passed through during the last 5 years, sparks flying into the evening. General store sat beside it. At the center of town stood the building that mattered most. Every frontier town had one. Sometimes it was the place where the town slowly rotted from the inside. The horse snorted softly. David gently patted its neck. Something ain't right here. The smell hit him immediately. Inside, the room was dimly lit by hanging shadows across the wooden floor, lazily pressing the keys while a few gamblers played cards at a round table. But the moment David stepped inside, the piano stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward him. The bartender was a thin man, with tired eyes and gray hair that hung loosely beneath his hat. He wiped a glass with a cloth, watching David carefully. "Whiskey," David said calmly as he reached the bar. The bartender poured the drink without saying a word. David took the glass and raised it slightly before taking a slow sip. The burning liquid slid down his throat, warming his chest. But his eyes were scanning the room. Years of surviving had taught him one thing. Danger always revealed itself in small details. A nervous twitch, a hand resting too close to a gun, or silence that lasted just a little too long. That's when he noticed them. 3 men sitting at a table near the window. They weren't drinking. They weren't talking. They were watching him. The man in the center was clearly their leader. He had a wide jaw, cold eyes, and a scar running from his ear down to his neck. His black coat was expensive, Something that didn't belong in a dusty town like Red Hollow. David finished his whiskey slowly. The man with the scar stood up. His chair scraped loudly across the floor as he walked toward David with a confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," the man said, "ain't every day we get a stranger riding into Red Hollow." David didn't turn around. He calmly placed the empty glass on the bar. "Just passing through." The man chuckled. "That's so." David could now see the reflection of the man in the dusty mirror behind the bar. He was close. Too close. "You see," the scarred man continued, "this town belongs to someone." David finally turned to face him. "And who might that be?" The man's smile grew wider. "Name's Victor Kane." The name caused a ripple of tension through the room. Even the bartender froze for a moment. David studied the man carefully. He had heard that name before. Victor Kane. A man rumored to control several frontier towns through fear and violence. A man who left graves behind wherever he went. David tilted his head slightly. "Never heard of you." The lie was obvious. Victor Kane's smile slowly faded. "You will?" One of Victor's men stood up behind him, resting his hand on the grip of his revolver. The room became painfully quiet. David sighed softly. "I was hoping for a quiet drink." Victor leaned closer. "You're standing in my town, cowboy." David looked down briefly at Victor's boots, then back into his eyes. "You sure about that?" Victor frowned. Before he could respond, the saloon doors suddenly slammed open. A young boy ran inside, breathing heavily and covered in dust. "Mr. Kane!" The boy shouted. "They found him." Victor's eyes sharpened instantly. "Found who?" The boy hesitated as he noticed David standing there. Then he whispered something into Victor's ear. Victor's expression changed. Not fear, not anger, something darker. Excitement. Victor slowly looked back at David. "Well now," he said quietly, "this just got interesting." David remained calm, but something about the moment made his instincts scream. Victor stepped back toward his men. "Looks like I've got business to attend to." He paused at the door and turned back toward David. "But don't go anywhere, cowboy." Victor's smile returned. "I got a feeling you and I are going to have a very long conversation." Then he stepped outside. His men followed. The saloon remained silent for several seconds after they left. The piano player slowly began playing again. The bartender leaned closer to David and whispered quietly, "You should leave town." David raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The bartender looked toward the door nervously. "Because anyone Victor Kane takes interest in usually ends up buried." David calmly poured himself another drink. He stared at the whiskey for a moment before speaking. "Tell me something," he said. The bartender nodded. "Who did they find?" The bartender swallowed. "A man." David waited. The bartender lowered his voice. "A man who's been hunting Victor Kane for the past 10 years. David's fingers slowly tightened around the glass. And the bartender leaned even closer. "They say that man finally came to Red Hollow." Tonight, David slowly lifted the glass to his lips. "And what's his name?" The bartender looked directly into David's eyes. "David Morgan." The glass stopped halfway to David's mouth. Outside, somewhere in the darkness of Red Hollow, a gunshot suddenly echoed through the night, and David realized something terrible. For a moment, David Morgan did not move. The sound of the gunshot still echoed through the streets of Red Hollow, like thunder rolling across dry land. Inside the saloon, every man had frozen again. Even the piano player's fingers hovered above the keys without touching them. The bartender slowly stepped back. "You should leave," he whispered again, his voice more urgent this time. But David didn't move. Instead, he calmly finished the whiskey in his glass. Outside, hurried footsteps rushed across the dirt road. Voices shouted orders in the distance. Horses neighed nervously as if they could feel the rising tension in the air. Something big was happening outside, and somehow David was already in the middle of it. He placed the empty glass on the counter and walked toward the saloon doors. Each step sounded heavy against the wooden floor. Some of the men inside moved aside as he passed. No one wanted to stand in the path of trouble. David pushed the swinging doors open and stepped outside. The night had arrived quickly over Red Hollow. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, throwing yellow light onto the dusty street. A crowd had gathered near the edge of town, where Victor Kane and his men stood beside several horses. David could see a body lying on the ground. 2 men were standing over it. Victor Kane turned when he noticed David stepping out of the saloon. "Well, look who decided to join us," Victor said with a slow grin. David walked closer, but stopped several feet away. The man on the ground wasn't dead. He was breathing. Barely. His clothes were torn and dusty, and his face was bruised badly. Blood ran down from a cut on his forehead. One of Victor's men kicked the man's leg. "Wake up," he growled. The injured man groaned weakly. Victor crouched beside him. "So," Victor said calmly, "you finally found me." The injured man struggled to lift his head. His eyes were barely open. But when he spoke, his voice carried something strange. Confidence. "You were never hiding," the man said weakly. "You were just waiting." Victor chuckled softly. "That's true." He stood up slowly and dusted off his coat. 10 years you've been chasing me," Victor continued. "Across towns, mountains, deserts." He leaned down closer to the injured man. "And now, look at you." The man on the ground smiled faintly despite the blood on his face. "Yeah," he whispered, "but I found you." Victor's smile disappeared for a second. Then he laughed again. "You sure did." He suddenly pulled his revolver from his holster and pointed it directly at the man's head. The crowd stepped back. Even the wind seemed to stop. David watched carefully. Something didn't feel right. The injured man turned his head slightly toward David. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, the man blinked twice. Slowly. It was not random. It was a signal. David felt a strange chill run down his spine. Victor noticed nothing. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. "You know," Victor said casually, "I expected the famous hunter of criminals to put up more of a fight." The man on the ground coughed weakly. "I already won." Victor frowned. Before he could ask what that meant, the injured man suddenly laughed. It wasn't a weak laugh. It was calm. Almost satisfied. Victor's expression hardened. "What's so funny?" The man turned, his eyes toward the sky. Then he said something that made the entire street go silent. "You already told him everything." Victor blinked. "What?" Slowly, the man lifted a trembling finger and pointed. Not at Victor. At David. Every head turned toward the cowboy standing in the lantern light. Victor's eyes narrowed immediately. David remained still, calm, but now every gunman around Victor Kane was watching him closely. Victor slowly lowered his revolver. Then he began to smile again. "Oh." He turned his head toward David. "Now this is interesting." Victor walked slowly toward him. "You see," Victor continued, "this man here has spent 10 years hunting me." He gestured toward the injured man behind him. "And tonight he rides into town, right when another stranger arrives." Victor stopped a few steps away from David. "Coincidence?" David shrugged slightly. "Could be." Victor studied him carefully. Then he suddenly turned and fired his revolver into the ground beside the injured man's head. The loud blast made several people jump. The injured man didn't react. Victor turned back toward David. "If you're working with him," Victor said quietly, "you're braver than you look." David tilted his head. "And if I'm not?" Victor smiled wider. "Then you're the unluckiest man in Red Hollow." The crowd around them slowly backed away. Everyone knew what was about to happen. A showdown. But before either man could move, another sound suddenly echoed through the night. Hooves. Fast, very fast. Everyone turned toward the road leading into town. A group of riders burst out of the darkness, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they raced toward Red Hollow. 6 riders, all armed. Victor frowned. Who the hell are they? The riders slowed as they reached the town, surrounding the area in seconds. Their leader jumped off his horse. He wore a long coat and a silver star pinned to his chest. A lawman. The crowd gasped. The sheriff stepped forward, his eyes locked on Victor Kane. Evening, Kane. Victor's jaw tightened. Sullivan. Sheriff Sullivan looked around the scene calmly. His eyes moved from Victor to the injured man on the ground, and finally to David. He studied David for a long moment. Then something surprising happened. The sheriff nodded slightly toward him, like he already knew him. Victor noticed it too. His smile returned slowly. Oh, now I see. He laughed quietly. This whole thing was a trap. The sheriff placed his hand near his gun. Drop your weapon, Kane. Victor raised his hands slightly, but did not drop the revolver. You know what's funny? Victor said calmly. Sheriff Sullivan said nothing. Victor turned his head toward David again. I knew someone was hunting me. He gestured toward the injured man, and I knew the law was getting close. Then he pointed directly at David. But I didn't know there were 2 hunters. The sheriff's expression hardened. The injured man on the ground tried to sit up slightly, and David Morgan finally spoke again. Slowly, calmly. You're wrong. Victor raised an eyebrow. Oh! David's eyes became colder. There were never 2 hunters. The wind blew dust across the street. Everyone waited for him to continue. David looked at the injured man on the ground, then back at Victor Kane. There were 3. Victor's smile vanished. Sheriff Sullivan suddenly drew his revolver. Victor's men grabbed their guns. The entire street exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted. Horses screamed. People ran for cover as bullets tore through wooden walls and lanterns shattered into sparks. David moved faster than anyone expected. His revolver flashed in the lantern light. One of Victor's gunmen dropped instantly. Another shot rang out. Another man fell. Victor dove behind a water trough as bullets slammed into the wood beside him. The sheriff and his deputies fired from the opposite side of the street. Within seconds, the quiet town of Red Hollow had turned into a battlefield. Dust and smoke filled the air. But in the middle of the chaos, the injured man on the ground suddenly stood up, perfectly steady. No pain, no weakness. He wiped the fake blood from his face and calmly pulled a hidden revolver from inside his coat. Then he aimed it directly at Victor Kane and said something that made Victor's eyes widen in pure shock. Game's over, Kane. Because the man Victor thought he had captured was never injured at all. Dust filled the air of Red Hollow as the final gunshots echoed. Between the wooden buildings, the smell of gunpowder drifted slowly through the night while frightened horses pulled against their ropes. The sudden gunfight had lasted less than a minute, but it felt much longer to everyone watching. When the shooting finally stopped, the dusty street became silent again. 2 of Victor Kane's men lay on the ground near the saloon porch. Another one had dropped his gun and raised his hands, fear clear on his face. Sheriff Sullivan and his deputies carefully stepped forward, their revolvers still raised. Victor Kane remained behind the wooden water trough, breathing heavily. He slowly lifted his head. The man he thought was badly injured now stood in the middle of the street, strong and steady, holding a revolver aimed directly at him. Victor stared at him in disbelief. You, Victor whispered. The man wiped the last of the fake blood from his face and smiled calmly. Yeah, he said. For 10 years, you've been running. Victor slowly stood up from behind the trough. His revolver was still in his hand. The sheriff shouted from the side of the street. Drop the weapon, Kane. Victor ignored him. His eyes moved from the fake injured man to Sheriff Sullivan, and finally to David Morgan. Something slowly changed in his expression. Understanding. Then he laughed. A slow, quiet laugh. "So that's it," Victor said. He gestured toward the fake injured man. "You pretended to be captured." Then he pointed toward the sheriff. "You waited until I showed myself." Finally, his eyes settled on David. "And you?" Victor smiled again. "You were the last piece." David didn't move. The lantern light flickered across his face, under the brim of his cowboy hat. Victor tilted his head. "But there's one thing I still don't understand." The street remained quiet. No one fired. Everyone was waiting. Victor spoke again. "How did you know I would be here tonight?" The fake injured man stepped forward slowly. "Because you had no choice." Victor frowned. The man continued. 3 weeks ago, we started spreading rumors across the territory." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Rumors about a hidden map. A map that shows where you buried the gold you stole during the train robberies." The crowd murmured softly. Victor Kane had robbed several trains years ago and disappeared with a fortune in gold. No one ever found it. Victor chuckled again. "You expect me to believe that?" The man shrugged. "We didn't expect you to believe it." He pointed toward the saloon. "We expected your men to believe it." Victor's smile slowly faded. Sheriff Sullivan stepped forward now. "Your men have been asking questions in every town," the sheriff said. "They were looking for that map." Victor's jaw tightened. The fake injured man continued. "And we knew something else about you." Victor stared at him silently. "You never trust anyone," the man said. "If your men heard about a map to your gold, you'd come check it yourself." The wind pushed dust across the empty street. Victor looked around slowly. At the bodies of his men, at the deputies surrounding him, at the cowboy standing quietly near the center of town. Victor laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded tired. "You built an entire trap, just to catch me." The sheriff nodded. 10 years of running ends tonight." Victor looked down at the revolver still in his hand. Then he looked back up. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. No one answered. Victor slowly raised the revolver, but he didn't point it at the sheriff, or the fake injured man, or the deputies. He pointed it at David. Everyone froze. Sheriff Sullivan shouted immediately, "Kane, don't." Victor ignored him. His eyes were locked on David. "You," Victor said quietly. "Something about you bothered me from the moment I saw you." David remained calm. The barrel of Victor's gun pointed directly at his chest. "You didn't act like a man who wandered into trouble," Victor continued. "You acted like a man who already knew where the trouble was." The fake injured man stepped forward slightly. "Kane." Victor raised his other hand to silence him. "No." His eyes remained fixed on David. "So tell me something, cowboy." Victor smiled slightly. "Who are you, really?" The dusty wind moved through the street again. For a long moment, David said nothing. Then he slowly lifted his head. The lantern light revealed his face more clearly. He reached into his coat. Several deputies instantly raised their guns. But David moved slowly, carefully. He pulled out a small leather badge. Old, worn. He tossed it toward Victor. Victor caught it with his free hand and looked down. His expression changed immediately. The badge read, "United States Marshal." Victor looked back up slowly. "So that's it." David finally spoke. His voice was calm. "I've been tracking you for 6 years." The sheriff and the fake injured man exchanged surprised looks. Victor laughed softly again. 6 years. He shook his head. "You're late." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Victor smiled again. "You see, everyone thinks Victor Kane is the mastermind." The street became quiet again. "But the truth is," Victor tilted his head slightly, "I was never the leader." The sheriff frowned. "What are you talking about?" Victor looked directly at David. "There's someone else." The wind picked up again, making the lantern flames flicker. "A man smarter than me," Victor continued. "A man who planned every train robbery. A man who took most of the gold." Sheriff Sullivan stepped forward. "Who?" Victor smiled slowly. That's the funny part. He raised the revolver slightly. And you've already met him. Everyone looked confused. Victor's eyes shifted past David, toward the saloon. Slowly, the swinging doors creaked open behind them. A man stepped out. The bartender. The same quiet bartender who had been serving drinks earlier that night. But now, he wasn't holding a bottle. He was holding a rifle, pointed directly at David. The entire street froze again. The bartender smiled calmly. "Well done, Victor," he said. Victor lowered his revolver. "You took your time." The sheriff whispered in shock. "You?" The bartender shrugged. "Running a small-town saloon is the perfect hiding place." He stepped down from the porch. "Everyone talks while they drink." He looked toward David. "And tonight, they brought the hunters straight to me." The rifle clicked as he pulled the lever. David's hand slowly moved closer to his revolver. But the bartender shook his head. "I wouldn't try that." The lantern light flickered again as the wind moved through Red Hollow. The bartender smiled calmly. "You spent 10 years chasing the wrong man." He nodded toward Victor. He was just the distraction. The rifle barrel stayed perfectly steady. "And now," the bartender said quietly, "the real hunt begins."